Coming up on this edition of Safari Changemakers.
Yeah.
How does a guest, while staying at a lodge and hopefully being looked after in a very special, unique, and intimate way, how do they feel connected to the community and conservation issues around them? And that's been a very important part of our journey.
This is Safari Changemakers. Conversations with Africa's most innovative visionaries, the guardians, pioneers, and trailblazers, offering solutions to the most pressing challenges facing the continent. Over-tourism, human-wildlife conflict, the climate crisis, and environmental degradation. Conversations that reveal bold strategies for sustainable tourism leading to economic opportunities for indigenous communities while protecting local ecosystems and wildlife.
Today we talk with the founder of Volcanoes Safaris, Praveen Moman, the father of guerrilla tourism. For over 20 years, Volcanoes has been at the forefront of sustainable tourism in Rwanda and Uganda, uplifting local communities while helping protect the apes, chimps, and other primates found there. Hello, Praveen. It's great to see you.
And you, Karin. It's been a long time. We haven't talked, but it's always great to chat. We've known each other such a long time.
I think it goes back, honestly, maybe over 20-something years. And of course, I had an experience early on, probably about 16 years ago, myself traveling to one of your lodges, to Virunga Lodge in Rwanda. But I'm excited to jump right in and talk a little bit about your early beginnings with this. In a film I saw about walking in the foothills at the age of 12 with your father. And I'm really interested in how those early experiences shape your vision for what safari tourism sort of could become.
Well, thank you again, Karin. It's a great pleasure to connect to an old friend such as yourself. You know, you've been one of the people who've supported us from our early days and know about our journey. And I really appreciate you taking an interest in what we've done. So yes, in a way, the story goes back for me a long way with our African connections, because my father moved from India to East Africa in 1937. But already I've had family in East Africa since 1905. So that's been a very long historical connection with different parts of East Africa. And then in the 1960s, when I was 12, as you've said, I went walking in the Virunga volcanoes on the Ugandan side, on the what is called Mugahinga. And it was a very, very special and momentous event in my life, which is why many years later, in the mid-90s, I went back there, and that's what led to the founding of Volcanoes Safaris in 1997. And there's another coincidence. When I first went walking in the Virungas in the mid-60s, it was the time that Dian Fossey had started working in the Virunga volcanoes, first actually in Mugahinga, then on the Congolese side, and then finally she did her big work on the Rwandese side, as you know, when she set up the Karisoki Center high up between two volcanoes. So it's interesting that, you know, I've had this very long connection with the Virungas, and that's what pulled me back to this part of the world to set up Volcanoes Safaris. And I guess why is it important to me? What has been the journey about? Partly, of course, I was lucky that our backyard was something special. It had all these different ecosystems, quite small, relative to, say, Yellowstone, relative to, say, Serengeti. But each of them is very, very precious and magical in the flora and fauna they have, in the ecosystems, in the animals they support. So you kind of take this for granted as your child. When you're a child, you see the Virungas, you see the Rwenzori, you see the Queen Elizabeth National Park, you see the Kibale Forest where the chimps live. And these are the places now, the places of childhood, my playground as a child, where Volcanoes Safaris now exists as a company. and 27 years later, has become, the great ape specialist of the world. We are the specialists of gorilla and chimp tourism.
Back then, there was no gorilla and chimp tourism, though. The people, or was there? Was there any kind of tourism at that
There
time?
was, yes, because as we said, Fossey's work started in the Virungas in the mid-60s, and she was killed on the Rwanda side of the mountain in 1985. In the final years of her life, they had set up the mountain gorilla tourism program on the Rwanda side. A number of Americans have been central to this story. You had already, your listeners may be interested to know, somebody called Carl Akeley, who worked at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He went to work on the Rwandese and Congolese side of the mountain from 1915 onwards. And he's the one who persuaded the King of Belgium. Of course, Rwanda and Congo were Belgian colonies at the time. And in 1925, the Belgian king agreed to setting up the gorilla sanctuary, to creating Parc National d'Albert, as it's called. He was called King Albert. So Parc National d'Albert was created in 1925 because of the vision and the foresight of Carl Akeley from America. So that was the beginning of the long American conservation connection with this region. And it continues again with the 1950s with George Schaler's work, who worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society. And then, of course, Dian Fossey's work. And then the two other Americans who were instrumental in setting up tourism on the Rwandese side were Bill Weber and Amy Vedder.
Okay.
And they worked with Dian Fossey as young researchers. Fossey was not very keen on tourism. She was worried about the consequences of tourism on gorillas in terms of disease or in terms of them becoming so habituated to human presence that poachers might threaten them. So the genesis of tourism started on the Rwandese side in the early 80s. And even actually when I was a child in the 60s in Uganda, a man called Walter Baumgartel, who owned a little hotel on the Ugandan side of the mountain, had started his, if you like, basic experiments with tourism with a local tracker called Reuben. So people had been doing this for some time. Then, of course, there was the conflict in Uganda, and things stopped working there from about 1979 until tourism officially started on the Ugandan side in 1991. But of course, on the Rwandese side, it also went through the conflict period. It was only after the genocide, after the Tutsi in 1995, that things started to settle down, and tourism restarted in Rwanda from 2000.
I do remember, because I got into tourism in 1987, actually, into Africa tourism. And I do remember, like, in my early years, we had sold some stuff in Rwanda, like in the 80, the genocide was in
94.
94. So we had sold maybe some things in like 91, 92 maybe. Then it all really obviously stopped, and then came back, after the genocide.
Okay, so in a way, as we've discussed, from the 60s and the 80s, there were different experiments, and there was sort of formal tourism in the last few years of Dian Fossey's life. But it's really in the 90s that this story picks up. And coincidentally, that's when I got involved. Volcanoes, as we said, was set up in 1997. The tourism on the Ugandan side for gorillas started post-1991, and on the Rwandese side in 2000. So we became, if you like, the new wave of tourism being established. So there were one or two companies with small camps here and there. But in the end, we became the company that sort of mastered this. So we set up a camp in Mugahinga, where this one family was, and then in Windy in 2000. So celebrating 25 years of that. And then we became the first company in the world to open an office in Kigali in 2000. And then shortly after that, we had the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the gorillas, so to speak, by a German officer who was the resident in Rwanda. To celebrate that discovery by Kant, the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund brought their board to Rwanda in 2002, and we were privileged to look after the board, and I was privileged to travel with them. And that's what then inspired me to start thinking of getting a site on the Rwandese side in 2002. And in 2004, we became the first international company, to open a lodge near the Mountain Gorilla Park in Rwanda. And that was the beginning of the story of building Virunga Lodge. And one day I got a call from this runner that I had found, and he said to me, "I found this site, you'll like it." What makes a good site is often a mystery till you've made it a good site. For me, what I love is a place that has big views. It's a sense of liberation, a sense of connecting to a landscape.
Okay, so when I visited it, it was about 6 years old. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then you've opened quite a few other lodges since then. So how would you say that your approach from then to now, just with regard to the lodges themselves, has sort of changed from this first lodge, Virunga, and then the other lodges?
Because when I was growing up as a child in Africa in the 50s and 60s, it now seems a very long time ago, tourism was very simple, because the luxury of tourism at the time was to escape from the small towns where we lived, and those travelers who came from Europe and America, to escape to the bush, and in a sense have nothing while you were staying in the bush. People like Bob Hope and John Wayne, and the people who made the African Queen, and actually the British Queen, they would go and stay in the bush. But you didn't expect luxury. On the contrary, the luxury was to have nothing. So it was very simple, basic, if you like, in today's terms. Often there would be no running water. You were either in a very simple small tent, or in a round oval, a banda of some sort, or possibly an old farmhouse or a government-owned rest house, and with very simple utilitarian furniture. Started in 1997. That's what was my model, if you like. That's what I do aspire to do. The second change, really, and the second development has been that most of African tourism has been dominated by the safaris, the game safaris on the savannah. And when you start working, as I've done now for 27 years, with gorillas and chimp safaris, they, of course, do not live on the savannah. They live in high mountain areas. Fossey's own camp at Karisoke in Rwanda, for example, was at 10,000 feet, and she actually regularly had pneumonia, and she regularly wouldn't see the sun. It was so high up. Now our camps are not so high up, more like 5,000, 6,000 feet high. Yeah. So you have to think of high altitude tourism, forest tourism, mountain tourism. And that's what made us develop our own way of thinking about this model for great ape ecotourism. We went away from the tented approach, and we started building these hand-built lodges. And although the shells were quite basic when we started building in 1997, they all exist and have all been upgraded to be international level luxury lodges, while retaining, if you like, a quaint, hand-built, African look about them. And that's what our guests love most. There's a sense of place, a sense of context. So now, as you said, we have 5 lodges. We have 3 gorilla lodges, Mount Kahinga in Uganda and Windi in Uganda, Virunga in Rwanda, and we have 2 chimpanzee lodges, Chambura, which we built about 14 years ago on the edge of Queen Elizabeth National Park in Western Uganda, and in 2024 we opened Kibale Lodge. And they all, they're connected. They obviously I happen to be the founder of this company and still the CEO and the chief designer and builder.
Yeah.
So there's a big continuity in how these lodges have evolved, what they offer, their style and their approach. But there's also a big evolution from, if you like, mud huts 97, inspired by the 50s. Now they're international luxury lodges, so that the rooms are spacious. They'll have fireplaces. They'll have, bathrooms that people expect today.
Yeah.
The food, the cuisine will be attentive and at a level you'd expect. It's trying to mix, if you like, fine dining with the tradition of camps, but being modern and pleasing. So it's been an interesting journey, and I'm very pleased we've managed to make it. And I'm pleased in a way we've managed to evolve from that offering. Sometimes people say, oh, by changing, have you lost your soul? I don't think so. I think we've kept our soul and improved our product to a much better level.
Well, I saw that you had a competitor who called you borderline crazy for building in this area. Of course.
When I see where we are today, it's actually unbelievable, because most people didn't even believe it would work. You've got to respect somebody. He found the location, then he built the road. You've got to be borderline crazy. But that's what we need in an industry like ours.
Of course, I think that same competitor has now done the same. But what gave you the courage there to persist to do this, regardless of the area and the conditions, and as you said, pneumonia, and just all of that back then? Because I think you were really the one who started some of this, and a lot are following you.
Well, thank you, Karin. I guess it's because I had a very long association with this area. As I said, we've had family there since 1905. And secondly, my father had a very strong passion for the wilderness, the wildlife, and people of East Africa. So for him, chasing the rainbow, so to speak, chasing the blue skies, going to these parks was really part of his life's ambition, what he spent time doing. So that's what we grew up doing. So when I started, I had this, if you like, already in my blood, in my background. And despite the difficult start, in 1997, things were still unsettled. It was only 3 years after the Rwandese genocide. It had affected that whole Great Lakes area. It was kind of, still finding its feet. But I was determined to get on and do something. And I must say the support and the encouragement of first the Ugandan government and the Rwandan government was very important. And not only support in general terms, but working with their security forces to understand what the situation was critical to our work. And also the support and advice of the main international missions, particularly the UK government and the American government. So slowly, we managed to understand what the region was about and started to work there, and then slowly build these simple camps and then evolve them. And of course, what makes a business, what makes life is people. And the communities around our lodges, somehow they were very sympathetic and welcoming to us. And even when if things were not easy, they would be the first to tell us, you need to be careful about this. So that very strong, close relationship was important, and they provided workers from an early period. So the Fullies, as they are called in Swahili, by and large people from around our villages. They would help build our lodges, and eventually some of them would work in our lodges. So there's a lady called Maria Tanaz who works at Virunga. She was, a daily worker, so to speak, during the building of Virunga, and used to do the pointing of the tiles on the veranda with a teaspoon. And eventually she seemed a very solid lady. She was raising her family and she wanted to work. And for the last many years, she's been head of laundry. So those things are important to us. This is our village. These are our connections. Yeah, these are our people. So we worked really well with them, and that's been important. So both the people who form our wider community and those who have become part of our lodge community are very important. And that in turn led us to do things, again, in a slightly different way to possibly how the savanna companies work. The large expanses of savanna in other countries in East Africa, generally, there are no people that live in those areas. They live very far away.
That's true. Yeah.
So people's part of your life. It's nomadic people who live a long way away. Ours are tiny habitats that we discussed, and at our gate is where the local people live.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that bond and that understanding and that interaction was very important. And that led to another important process of our journey, if you like, another stage in our journey, where for the last 25 odd years, we've started we started doing community and conservation projects to our lodges. So each lodge has very strong conservation community projects linked to the work that we feel needs to be done there. So in Gahinga, for example, our first lodge, we built 7 years ago a village for the Batwa. And the Batwa are the original hunter-gatherers of this area. And sadly, when the parks were formalized in 1991, they were evicted from the parks. And this, of course, has happened in many countries in the world. The US, when it's created its wilderness areas, have evicted their indigenous people, the Native Americans. Anyway, for a while, we had these Batwa indigenous people who were at our gate, who were, if you like, an irritant. They behaved in an antisocial way. They didn't have, formal lifestyles. They didn't have economic activities. They would often, be on alcohol or substance abuse. So initially, we were not very positive about them. But then I began to realize that they had major issues and we should not ignore them. And that's what made us set up the Gahinga Batwa village, which again you can see on our website. In Chambura, where the chimps live, we have had a long-term program safeguarding the gorge where this community of now 33 chimps live.
Kiambura Gorge has a small community of chimpanzees that is now isolated by fragmentation of the original forest. The Jane Goodall Institute is delighted to work with the Kiambura Gorge Ecosystem Project to develop community-led conservation.
We are creating this buffer zone to stop the conflicts between the human and the apes.
When we started, it was about 15 chimps. So the buffer is creating space between humans and the chimps and the wildlife. So we've added more and more land to create this buffer. In Virunga, we have a community center where we train local people, whether it's in tailoring or in craft making. And guests can also donate water tanks.
Can you imagine to carry a jerrycan of 20 liters from down up to here?
So I think that to me has become as important as our lodges. Yeah. How does the guest, while staying at a lodge and hopefully being looked after in a very special, unique and intimate way, how do they feel connected to the community and conservation issues around them? And that's been a very important part of our journey.
It's interesting that initially, I think the focus was on the wildlife conservation and not really looking at the people who live around wildlife areas. That wasn't a consideration. The fact that the Batwa were just moved, there wasn't a plan in place. Like, how are we going to look at the local people and incorporate them and make sure that this is sustainable and something that they will want to be part of in the future? That wasn't part of the plan, right, in the beginning.
This displacement of people has repeated itself many times. The US national parks and European areas, other parts. And I think it's a pity, it's a pity the learning has been slow. I mean, I understand when I've read a bit about the formation of the parks in the US. And of course, the wilderness areas in the US are some of the finest in the world. So towards the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, when they started being created, they were created in a way for privileged people. Conservation was about privilege in a way, wasn't it? That these wild spaces, whether it's Yosemite or Yellowstone, had to be preserved for those who appreciated them.
Yeah.
And that was generally the privileged people. So again, the same happened. The wilderness spaces were created, demarcated. The wilderness was to be protected and the wildlife, and any people within were moved out. In my way of thinking, human beings have to be part of the conservation chain. And I expressed this in a TED talk I did some years ago in Bend, Oregon. And I think more than that, not only should humans be part of the conservation chain, conservation itself should be part of the economic mainstream. And why do I say that? It's so that, large tracts of land in areas that are heavily populated need to make a return for the economy of that country and for the local people around. If it does not put bread on the table for people around the gorilla and chimp parks in Uganda and Rwanda, then you must ask yourself, why should they support the preservation of the park and the gorilla and chimp species? After all, they're not going to pay $1,500 a pop to go gorilla tracking, right? Yep. What they need is farmland. What they need is food. So in my thinking, if you want to look after gorillas and chimps and wildlife, you need to think about this as a whole financial equation, that there is an economic return, and you shouldn't be ashamed of that. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, that's something terrible. But the financial return that you get must be then invested for the local people and infrastructure around to make sure that they benefit and then they support the ecosystems.
It goes to that hierarchy of needs. I mean, people have to have shelter, food, safety, all of that before they're going to start taking care of something else. That's a higher level need, as you said, for the privileged. Yeah, you've been doing this for a while. You've done some really unique initiatives. You just mentioned some of them. One that I know was the Bwindi Bar, and it kind of changed the dynamics of the local employment and guest experiences. Tell us a little bit about the Bwindi Bar.
Before I talk a bit about Bwindi Bar, I think it's an interesting contrast. Something like Yellowstone, for example. The Greater Yellowstone is 30,000 square kilometers. The 4 mountain gorilla parks together are 700 square kilometers.
Wow. Okay.
But it puts it in context that, this iconic species, the mountain gorilla, of which we have less than 1,100 left in the world, live in this tiny habitat. But it doesn't stop there. Around the tiny habitat of the 4 mountain gorilla parks in Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC, some of the areas are so heavily populated that there's about 1,000 people per square kilometer. The US average it obviously varies a lot between different areas, but it's often 200 to 300 per square kilometer. So again, it puts in context that you have, people who are not privileged, people who are on the breadline, they're striving to have enough food for their families. As you said, there's the kind of equation of life. They need to survive. And that's what I think makes the moral imperative so strong, making sure the communities have something so the habitat and the wildlife survives. And Bwindi Bar is just a sort of, fun, small place on the main street of Bwindi, next to the entrance to the gorilla park. And we happen to acquire this main street small space. And it's a kind of fun, funky bar, but it has a purpose again. Local youths are trained to learn about hospitality. And so we do that as part of our nonprofit work, so that, you're uplifting the skill base in the area. And some of these guys end up working for us, some of the young girls and boys, but most of them end up working for other hospitality units. And so that's, again, we know something about hospitality. We have lodges, we train our own staff. So that's a way of sharing what we know with others in our community. in a way that hopefully helps them then get better jobs and again help their families have better economic gain for the future. And maybe I could add, not only are we doing our own projects, what we've also evolved as part of our work is, having worked so long in this area and being kind of special on it, we have from the beginning had very strong links with the different non-profits. I mentioned, the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, who've been our oldest partners in this area. But now we have, partnerships supporting them and working with them, but also with gorilla doctors, who are the vets that go into the forest when a gorilla is sick, when a gorilla gets a snare around their leg. We have a relationship with the Jane Goodall Institute, working on chimps. Also with a very interesting project led by a Ugandan lady, Gladys Kalema, Conservation of Public Health, that looks exactly at the interface of disease transmission between humans and gorillas around Windy. And, she's set up a wonderful institution, so we support that. Or a very interesting other chimp organization set up by Professor Richard Wrangham from Harvard, who has been working with the chimps around Kibale. And he and his team have again been monitoring that group of chimps there. There's about 1,500 chimps, working out what their behavior patterns are, how they're interrelating with each other. And it's become a very established research program. So by working with all these people, it's become very important because we all have different interests, but to my mind, overlapping and many joint interests. And as part of that, 3 years ago, we set up the Albertine Ape Alliance, which is an informal alliance between anybody and everybody who works in the Albertine Rift Valley, which is the Western Rift Valley in the area we work, which has some of the most unique species in the world, but also with big threats because of this population and development pressure. So again, this is where we believe that this kind of food chain of relationships is critical for the future as things change in Africa. And again, I don't know if your listeners are aware of this, but Africa now is the fastest changing continent on the planet. From being relatively agricultural, relatively low population, relatively having quite minimal consumption, it's now urbanizing at a tremendous rate. That super fast urbanization, the fastest in the world, is producing 20 new cities in the next 20 years of 20 million each. For a continent that didn't have this urban exposure, that's big. But this is not confined only to the cities. Rural areas that had just people living in a very simple way are also urbanizing. The same demands, and the impact on the protected areas will be big. So discussion of this is important. And of course, the governments discuss this, but we feel that the private sector and the non-profit conservation sector and the community organizations must also play an important part in this.
These alliances and partnerships, are they also something that tourists, people who come in, people who are interested in visiting or understanding more about these, can they partake or learn more or be involved in some way?
Yes, there's two different elements to it. One is that, for example, at our lodges, we have, because of our close partnerships with these conservation organizations, we offer as part of the guest experience, depending on people's program and time available, that they can spend time being briefed by one of these conservation organizations. Yeah. And for a fee that is paid to the conservation organization, the gorilla doctors or the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund or the Goodall or Conservation Through Public Health can come and have an in-depth briefing with the guests, which I think is very, very interesting and important for them. And even more than that, if the guests wish to go in the forest when they are tracking chimps or gorillas with an expert from that organization, that too we can arrange. So this, I think, is another element of it. And of course, if a guest is that keen, they can, of course, set up an internship with such an organization. So I think this has become a critical part of this, that you should not, you can use the experience of going gorilla and chimp trekking, not just as a vacation, about learning about the whole wider issues, and in different ways participating in them, either supporting them financially, supporting one of our community or conservation projects, or being part of the advocacy that we all need in the world for these threatened species and for these, habitats that are under huge threat. And that's what I think is really special about a gorilla and chimp safari, that it's not just a vacation. You are connected to a whole ecosystem and a bunch of people who are trying to do something about it.
It seems, from my perspective as a safari planner, that part of my responsibility is to make sure that I allow our guests who are coming to you to have enough time. They should have the ability to discover a little bit more while they're there. Having someone like that lead or meet with them, is that only possible if they're a big group of people, or could that be done even for a couple or a family who was visiting?
We've been in the business of curating safaris for our guests for 27 years. We'll provide what guests need. Different guests have different amounts of time and different interests, but whether it's one person or a large group, it can be done. And it's important to do it. It's a really magical insight into the world of great ape conservation and ecotourism. And it's really a privilege to be able to do that. And as you said, I think that's the critical thing, Karin, that people allow enough time. Sometimes, the feeling is, oh, I'm going to Africa. I'm just going to go to this part of Africa. I'll see a gorilla and a chimp. That'll take, 1 day for this, 1 day for this. I've ticked the box, as you've said, and that's it. Actually, that's the beginning. You can spend several days around our lodges and around the national parks, doing a whole series of different activities around the wildlife, yes, around the park, but also these community organizations and conservation work and other non-profit work. And I think that's what guests should really be encouraged to do. The curation of a safari is the ultimate joy. It's not just about, seeing a gorilla for an hour.
Yeah, building in that time for more and the additional experiences. I don't think people understand the topography and the fact that people in the villages live so close, and just the evolving nature of what's happening in Africa. I think this is all new for most people. I'm just wondering, do you have any like a story specifically of a guest that you know of that had an interaction with the local community that really turned into sort of a unexpected long-term impact?
We have different guests who have been, very affected by the experience. So, for example, for our Batwa village in Gahinga, we have a number of guests who have become long-term supporters. They've realized that, we are trying to give this community a chance in the world. We have health visitors who come, we have teachers who come, we have those who advise on antisocial issues, and we fund the schooling of the children. So I guess a number of them have started becoming long-term supporters of that. And that's really gratifying to see. And then sometimes we had somebody who's been a guest and developed an entirely kind of life-changing experience. We have Nicole Simmons, who's from the shopping malls of Minnesota, so to speak, who I was speaking to earlier today. And she was a guest about 20 odd years ago. And she was very interested in primates. She wasn't a primatologist then. I can't remember what she did. I think she had an office job. And she did one of our curated safaris with an expert guide who showed her around, the different chimp and gorilla communities. And she also met a chimp researcher who worked in the area. And some years later, she came back to the area and then asked, could she become a researcher at our Attenborough site to study chimps. And, she'd got enough kind of exposure to this in those years to learn the basics of it. And so for the last almost 20 years, she has become the chimp expert of Attenborough. And although she's gone back to the US and to make sure she has a living and other things, she's writing up a PhD on this what the BBC called the lost chimps of Chambura, this,
Mhm.
30-odd community. So that's obviously had a major change on her life. And somebody like Ian Redmond, some of your guests might know, he was another researcher with Dian Fossey when he was a young man in the 1980s. And he's devoted his whole life to conservation challenges, especially gorillas and elephants. And he often guides in the area. He guided our first safari into Rwanda in 2000. And people who've met him, or one of our own Ugandan guides, Francis Chivanuka, who can identify 600 bird species, guests get really, enthralled by this, and they're in touch with our staff or others because it means a lot to them that they understand what's happening in the area. So they come back and understand what the changes are and where the world is going, so to speak.
So at minimum, do you think visiting the new Dian Fossey Center, the Ellen DeGeneres Center, is that at minimum, what people should do to sort of begin to learn more, and then something community oriented as
I think what our safari is trying to do is exactly have these curated experiences based around Lodge, and the Dian Fossey New Karisoki Center near the park headquarters in Rwanda is a great example. I mean, it is such a wonderful thing to behold. It was Dian Fossey struggling in the 60s and until the 80s in a tiny cabin, 10,000 feet up, and all her, equipment and other things had to be walked up, and she was, having a tough time being a researcher in those difficult conditions. And now you have this state-of-the-art research center. It's a very, very impressive place. And that's now become the longest gorilla research center in the world. It has over 50 years of the work that Fossey started. So yes, it's a great place, and it has many interactive things, especially for children and younger people. And you'll find in each of these places, there is a whole series of things you can add on. So that is a good example there. Of course, in places like Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda, we have also set up a lion project, Australian University. And that's become a major story where lions are collared and monitored. And, so that there's clear discussion and knowledge about the decline of lions. The lion population in that part of Africa and generally is in major decline.
I was going to say, what have you learned about the evolution? I mean, what's going on with the lions there?
It's, one of these classic human wildlife stories, right? When there was a lot of empty land, the humans and wildlife didn't encounter each other a lot. So things kind of worked okay. Now the population has grown. It lives right up to the edge of the parks, right next to the animals. So the chance of conflict grows. And in some cases, you do have local people grazing inside the park illegally. So when there are animals grazing inside the park, well, that's, fresh meat for a lion. So the lion comes along, either inside the park or outside the park, to eat a cow, to eat a goat, to eat a sheep. And the villager then tries to kill the lion. So understanding this pattern, trying to do something about it, having programs to help communities not have this close interaction, compensate them when they lose an animal. These are important things. So that's, another project we've got involved in. Nicole's long-term work of monitoring the chimps of Chambura is another major story. In each of these places, if guests make enough time, they'd be amazed what they learn. Again, in Chambura, we have a wetland we've reclaimed that was an illegal brickworks, which has now something like 200 bird species, many of which are endemic to the area, and a bridge we've built across the Chambura Gorge and its special ecosystem and the buffer zone around. So around each lodge, you'll find there's a number of very, very special things you can do, which are, a really amazing experience.
Do Europeans take a lot more time than Americans?
I don't think I want to comment on this. I don't want to get into trouble with
No, I just think, I mean, I think it has to do with our vacation time. I mean, I just see, our clients just take such limited time.
No, I think the vacation style is different in America, and I respect that and understand it. And the pressure is greater to pack in a lot. In my experience, in our part of the world, and generally my experience as a traveler, I think less can be more. Spending more time in one area, I think, is more rewarding and produces a much better takeaway from the whole thing. The interpretation you get, the links you build, the understanding. I would suggest don't just go to one gorilla park, go to two gorilla parks. Because the experience is different, the habitat is different. You will not think at all, why am I doing this twice? Again, with chimps, or do gorillas and chimps, because they're so special. It's a wonderful thing to do. And then on a next vacation, go to another part of Africa, or wherever it is you would like to go.
That first experience that someone has with a gorilla, when they see the gorillas for the first time, I mean, what's that like for people? I know what it was like for me, but
yeah, every animal is special. But the gorilla, of course, and in a different way, the chimpanzee is especially special because they're so close to humans. As you know, we share about 98% of our DNA with gorillas and chimps. And especially with the gorilla, which is quite a docile, quiet animal, just sitting in the forest, chewing away their vegetarian diet. They see you and they're as curious about you as you are.
Yeah.
So there's a magical connection, isn't there?
Yeah.
The chimp, of course, is more skittish, is more agile, is more wary, can be more violent, more difficult. So he's curious, but he's distant.
Yeah.
But the interaction, again, with the chimp is very strong, but different.
With gorillas, you can be so close to them. I just found it incredibly, like, almost meditative. That hour that we spent with them went very quickly, other than the babies running around and almost running over your feet. What role do you see luxury lodges taking over the next 10 years? And what are some long-term goals?
I think I would just suggest that we have to be responsible about what we expect. As I said, there's already a major change from the 1950s in what we expect as basic necessities, let alone luxury now. But I think a responsible traveler has to ask, what is the impact of this on the area that I'm visiting? What is the impact of this on the planet? There's a lot of talk about sustainability, isn't there? But sustainability, if we believe in it, has to be done by us and not other people. So humans, by definition, consume a lot, create a lot of waste. So the more we expect and the more we demand in terms of consumption, whether, for example, it's in types of food or in resources or other things, the more the footprint will be greater. I would pose the question. It's not for me to tell people how they should travel, but I think each of us should ask the question, how can I make the minimum impact possible? How can I leave the minimum footprint? How can I be a responsible tourist? And I'm sure, the sort of clients you have, they're thinking educated people. They'll work out for themselves what is appropriate and what isn't. But I think the search for more and more comes at a cost. And we need to be careful what that cost is and not forget it.
Do you have an innovative approach to minimize this environmental impact while maintaining luxury standards for clients?
We discuss it a lot, and we want to get it right for the guests and for ourselves. But for example, now, we just opened Kibale Lodge next to Kibale Forest. Virtually everything in that lodge, every piece of furniture, every lamp, the upholstery of the chair, of a lamp fitting and artifact is made by us on site or near the site by our colleagues in the area, either by our full-time staff or artisans who work with us or others. So that is one way I believe that you can simplify life. We don't want to import vast amounts of stuff from, Cape Town or New York or London. We believe we can make it. But of course, we must make it to the level that is of a quality that is acceptable. So this takes time. But, I've set up my design and build team 25 years ago. So we've had some time to work it out. What are the materials immediately available? And sometimes it might just be papyrus, so you can use papyrus. Sometimes it might be grass. Sometimes it's eucalyptus from local lots. And sometimes it might be something industrial like corrugated iron, but it's made locally. It's available to local people. It's a very durable material. So we often use corrugated iron as the base material to make a roof. So I don't want to live, in the Stone Age. I don't think that is possible. We're all living in the 21st century. Our travelers are, people who are used to a lot, who expect a lot, and they need to be comfortable and feel a level of sophistication and luxury. But I think there are ways of doing it so that you try and do it in context and try and do it as much in the local materials with local skills. You can, of course, container everything if you choose not to do that and fly it in with vast amounts of jumbo jets. Well, that's a choice that it's not a choice that would be appropriate for us.
That definitely answers the question. I know I interrupted you about sort of the future.
That's also become a central question, to the work of Volcanoes, because when I set up this, it was kind of a romantic dream. It was kind of an impulse. Then it didn't look as if it was going very, very far, very fast. People like my wife and others were concerned that, we were setting up something that, its return and investment was questionable. And it took many years for it to be, to set up something that was worthwhile, to connect to, people like yourselves and your guests, to have a market reputation, to have people come, to have people accept that this area was worth visiting and this way of doing a safari was special and important. So that's taken time. But I think having got past many of the difficulties we saw in early years, I'm sure there'll be difficulties in the future, but it's just cemented how important it is that those of us who work in that area, whether it's different lodge companies, competitor companies, whether it's the different conservation organizations, whether it's the governments and the protected area authorities, and also communities, we need to work together on this, because these are some of the most special habitats and wildlife populations of the world. And the last 25 years, we've seen major progress in opening up these parks, having guests come, re-establishing tourism, putting it on the market. Rwanda now is well known as a niche, high-level special destination. Yeah. Was that imaginable in 2000 when I first went to Kigali? No. The area was barely open, barely functioning, barely stable. So it's a privilege and a joy to see that. It's a privilege and a joy to see Uganda recover after the difficult Amin years, where people like my family were thrown out. So that's great progress. What we must all work at is the next 25 years, that the economic development, the massive changes, the population increase, the pressures of peace, if you like, the pressures of stability and development, don't impinge negatively on these very special ecosystems and the gorillas and chimps. That's what my goals are, that we as a company not only continue to offer better and better curated experiences for our guests, connect them to conservation and community activities related to all this, but that we are advocates for the future, all of us, the stakeholders in the area, that these areas survive and thrive, so they're still there. Dian Fossey, when she started working in the mid-60s in the gorilla park, she said, wouldn't it be a tragedy that the same century that saw the discovery of the gorillas in 1902 also saw that they are decimated by the end of the century? So we are lucky that her pessimism, which was quite valid at the time, when she was working there were possibly 300 gorillas. She didn't know if they would survive till 2000. Now we're over 1,000 gorillas, and of course many more chimpanzees. But I need to make sure that they do survive in 25 years' time. And that's something that we all need to participate in.
Just a couple of last few questions. Your proudest moment in the last year or two?
I guess the two in the last year that are special. One is marking the 20th anniversary of Virunga Lodge with all our partners. And I think you've seen the video clip of that. I think that was magical to have all the people we somehow started working together with a long time ago, coming together with such a strong bond and such a strong passion for all they do. And secondly, to build Kibale Lodge. Kibale is called the primate capital of the world because it has 13 species of primate, including 1,500 chimps. And to build a lodge of our own there, which has been a long-term dream, and with our own engineers and our own in-house local designers, and work together, has been a very, very special moment.
I know people will come and visit both Uganda and then Rwanda.
And of course, we didn't touch on this, but Akagera, the transformation of Akagera, would make a separate chat on its own. From a park that had to be cut post the civil war in Rwanda, it's become a major renaissance of that area and a major regeneration. And now it has rhino, it has various other species, it has lion, it's a really transformational experience what they've done to Akagera.
So now Rwanda has gorilla, chimp. Yeah. I don't know that I would say big five, but a full safari experience as well, and really an opportunity for people to spend quite a bit of time in Rwanda on its own.
Standalone destination.
It really is.
Spend a week there, and each ecosystem, each area of the country is so different. And there's of course Lake Kivu as well. Yeah. There's the whole culture of Rwanda. It has been a kingdom for centuries, and you can still see that in Nyanza, where the old capital of the kingdom was, and in the museum, the National Museum. And it's got amazing restaurants now.
And such a safe and beautiful country as well.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Praveen. Gosh, I hope our paths cross soon.
Wonderful.
Well, that's our show for today. Subscribe on YouTube and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Till next time, I'm Karin Jones.